So there's a really fascinating discussion that I'm seeing some Christian apologists and also some Muslim apologists having online about the question of divine deception. This is actually a topic that has interested me for years, maybe even over a decade now. I remember reading the first time in the Bible passages like Ezekiel that says, if the prophet speaks something false, I, the Lord, have deceived him. Or First Kings that talks about God sending a lying spirit into the mouths of false prophets. I remember reading this stuff, right? Um, and just thinking, what do I make of this, right? So it's been a pretty fascinating thing for me for quite some time, well over a decade, maybe 2 decades at this point, right? I've been studying theology in the Bible since 2006, so that would be 2 decades now. And I've also done some videos about the topic of divine deception before, where I kind of look at some of those passages from First Kings, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and some of the New Testament passages, because you have this concept of divine deception in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And I've looked at that previously in another video that I did last year in June. And I put a link to it in the show notes if you want to go and take a look at it. I'm not going to rehash that here. But I always find it interesting to see that, people are kind of having these discussions online and picking up on some of the conversations and things that I've also observed just in my 20 years or so now of studying theology. And I want to maybe just educate people about this concept. I don't think a lot of people are very familiar with it from either side, from the Christian side or the Muslim side. And again, it's this topic of divine deception. And what I'm actually seeing online is some Christian apologists saying, hey, in the Quran, Allah is described as the best of planners or plotters. And some have understood that to mean deceivers. And he guides whom he wills. He leads astray whom he wills. And then especially the concept of the crucifixion. In Islam and also in the Quran, you have this idea that Jesus was not crucified, but rather God made it appear so. So it looked like it was Jesus who was crucified, but he wasn't. And what was the purpose of that? According to the Quran, the purpose was to deceive the Jews as punishment for the Jews because they plotted evil against Jesus. God punished them by deceiving them further because they already had this deception in their hearts. God tricked them. They wanted to trick God. They wanted to trick the Messiah. Well, God tricked them. That's kind of the idea from the Quranic perspective. At least that's how I understand that. Feel free to correct me if there's any Muslim viewers watching. Let me know if I butchered that. Okay, so there's that side of the conversation that I see some apologists having. I've, of course, seen some Muslims respond and say that's a misunderstanding. As far as the best of plotters thing, and then comparing that to biblical passages where you have God explicitly saying, I have deceived the prophet, or very clearly you have passages where God hardens the heart of Pharaoh. He leads astray some people, and then he guides other people. You have that biblical theme. But you have a different perspective, obviously, in the Bible on the crucifixion. With the crucifixion in the Bible, Jesus wasn't just made to appear to have been crucified, but was actually crucified, right? And what's fascinating about this conversation is that most people may not realize that the concept of divine deception in the crucifixion is not just an Islamic theme. It's actually a Christian position as well. A lot of people don't realize this. Both Christians and Muslims believe that there is a certain sense in which God deceived with the crucifixion. The debate is not whether God deceived. The question is, who did he deceive? For the Muslims in the Quran, he deceived the Jews. For the Christian perspective in the Bible and in the patristic literature, so the traditional Christian position, is that God deceived Satan and the demons. So rather than deceiving the Jews, by engaging in the crucifixion, he deceived Satan. And this is part of an atonement theory. There's different atonement theories. The idea of the atonement is found all over the Old Testament. There's different forms and concepts of it. Of course, you have various atonement theories being discussed in the early patristic period. People have understood the crucifixion differently and the atonement question differently throughout history. And some of the earliest atonement theories involve this question of divine deception. And they involve what's called the fish hook theory. And the idea is this, that Satan thought he was doing good by crucifying and killing the Messiah. But it was in that very thing that God trapped him, that he used, to hook him, if you will, to hook Leviathan, as some of the patristic literature will reference it, harking on Old Testament themes and imagery with Leviathan and the great dragon and Satan. And so while they will present Jesus as effectively the worm on the hook that enticed Satan to go and crucify Jesus, but in the process, he's caught in the hook and he's destroyed. And so you have in the patristic literature, very explicitly, they'll say that God deceived Satan with this crucifixion event, with this ransom theory, and specifically fishhook theory, as it's often called by scholars. You'll find it all throughout the patristic literature, sometimes understood a little bit differently, but certainly you have that concept there. And so, for example, I mean, you can take a look at Origen, but certainly not limited to Origen. This is just a very quick, readily available quote that I pulled up for you from the patristic literature that you can find in that 38-volume set that I have behind me. It's translated into English, very well known. You can find it on New Advent. But Origen says here, "But to whom did he give his soul as a ransom for many? Surely not to God. Could it then be to the evil one?" That's Satan. "For he had us in his power until the ransom for us should be given to him, even the life or soul of Jesus, since he, the evil one, had been deceived and led to suppose that he was capable of mastering that soul. And he did not see that to hold him involved a trial of strength greater than he was equal to." So there's Origen in the ante-Nicene period, of course, certainly not limited to the ante-Nicene period. You have it in the Nicene and post-Nicene patristic period as well. Again, very, very common theme, but very explicitly saying that God deceives Satan. Augustine is uncomfortable with the concept of God deceiving. And so what he does is actually what the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible does. If you've ever read this big, huge tome here, this is the newly released Old and New Testament commentary, Ignatius Catholic Study Bible. And if you go to the passages that talk about God deceiving people, God deceiving prophets, it's clear. God is speaking actively. I have deceived him. I have deceived that prophet. But what the commentary will do is they will read it, perhaps some might argue reread it, as God is allowing them to be deceived, right? They'll make it passive to kind of soften the blow, and they'll just say the active aspect is just more rhetorical. And so they'll try to kind of get off the hook that way. And yes, I'm referencing the hook there. Ironically, in light of the discussion we're having here. So you'll see that concept. If you just kind of go to the commentary, they'll reread it as God doesn't harden people's hearts. He allowed their heart to be hardened. He doesn't deceive. He allowed them to be deceived. Well, Augustine does the same thing, right? That's not new to the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible. You have Augustine who comes along and he's a little uncomfortable with the idea of divine deception. And so what he does is he says, well, God doesn't actively deceive Satan. He allows for Satan to be deceived, and Satan deceived himself. So that's another element that you'll see in some of these discussions. For others, however, they're more comfortable with the concept of God deceiving, such as, again, Origen, who doesn't shy away from that kind of language, among others. Again, this is not just limited to ecclesiastical writers like Origen, but it also includes canonized saints in the patristic period. But let me also show you something here. There's a article that you can read called "The Last Temptation of Satan." Divine deception in Greek patristic interpretations of the Passion narrative. So it's a very dominant theme in the church fathers and the patristic literature. And you can get a feel for that from papers like this. And just look at the introduction, which is available in the public domain. A remarkable, excuse me, a remarkable number. Hold on, let me clear my throat. Sorry, I've been dealing with a cough today. A remarkable number of Greek patristic thinkers gave expression to the theory that Satan was deceived by Christ, who exploited his adversaries' mistaken belief that the object of his desires was a mere man and not the deity incarnate. Driven by an insatiable hunger for human bodies, the demonic appetite was drawn to devour the seemingly mortal flesh of Jesus. That flesh, however, was but a seductive lure concealing the power of divinity that brought about Satan's downfall, and even in some traditions, his salvation. that might raise an eyebrow. His salvation? What? Yeah, there are some church fathers who do believe that Satan and the demons will be fully restored one day after a period of punishment in hell. You can see this in various forms of the concept of apokatastasis in especially the Greek patristic tradition. And arguably, some will say that saints like Maximus the Confessor held to it. Others will contest that. So there is a debate on that. But you have, I believe, Gregory of Nyssa is very famous for putting that forward. Of course, Origen as well. So that's what he's referring to there. The crucial events in this drama of deception. By the way, you know another person, Isaac of Nineveh. I actually interviewed the foremost scholar in Syriac literature, Sebastian Brock, Dr. Brock, and I asked him about Saint Isaac of Nineveh, and did he maintain this idea of apokatastasis and this eventual universal salvation, and he affirmed that that's a correct reading. The crucial events in this drama of deception were Christ's agony in the garden and his suffering on the cross, moments of apparent weakness and vulnerability, which patristic writers daringly reconfigured as the cunning ruses of a master strategist defeating the enemy through his own devices. Such a radical reinterpretation of Scripture was achieved largely through the tools of typological and allegorical exegesis, by which patristic writers sought to explain and thereby eliminate the shame and folly of the cross, along with the attendant spectacles of Christ's apparent fearfulness and uncontrolled emotion. And the typology that they're referring to is, if you look at some of those passages in the Old Testament that references a worm, or references Leviathan, or references something like a hook, they'll allegorize and use typology to say that this is Jesus. Jesus is the worm on the hook catching Leviathan, so the Leviathan goes and tries to devour the worm, but in the process is himself destroyed. And so that's what they're referencing there. Okay. Also, you can read, there are some instances that have been put together in this paper. Hooking Leviathan, did Jesus deceive Satan at the cross? This person in that paper just kind of puts together some of the patristic quotes and has a little bit of a discussion about it. And interestingly, people have kind of picked up on this issue and connected it to passages like First Kings and Ezekiel, because I came across this, just a person's blog who's kind of discussing the concept of divine deception and atonement theories. And he connects the dots, right? He connects the dots with Ezekiel and First Kings and Isaiah, and was it First or Second Thessalonians, the great delusion that God sends upon people, the non-elect. The Bible in several challenging passages, such as First Kings 22:22, that's the one where God sends a lying spirit into the mouths of false prophets to deceive the people. In Ezekiel 14:9, where God says, if the prophet has spoken something falsely, I have deceived that prophet. Perhaps we'll take a look at it in a second. Well, those passages present God as involved in deceiving false prophets. So while divine deception is uncomfortable, in light of how scripture presents God, divine deception is present in scripture. So they're uncomfortable with the concept, but they do, in fairness, present it there. And I commend them for being fair and presenting it, however uncomfortable it may be. And they're connecting it to the concept of this form of atonement theory. And just for reference, Ezekiel 14:9, and if the prophet be deceived when he hath spoken a thing, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet, and I will stretch out my hand upon him, and I will destroy him from the midst of my people Israel. And you have Jeremiah saying, Lord, you have deceived me. And again, people try to read that as well. They were deceiving themselves, and so God deceived them for, I don't know, maybe you want to say that Jeremiah was deceiving himself, and then God further deceived Jeremiah. The prophet was deceiving himself, and therefore God deceived the prophet. And, again, some people attempt to read this as, well, God doesn't actively deceive. It's rather, God is allowing for them to be deceived. Well, look, somebody who's already committed to the Bible and Christianity will be satisfied with those explanations. Somebody who's skeptical, who's not committed to the Bible, they're not going to be satisfied with that, and they're just going to read that as you're just reading into the text and you're just trying to explain it away. So I don't think that those solutions are going to convince a skeptic. I think it's only going to convince somebody who's already committed and is kind of looking for a way to get off the hook, so to speak. So I wanted to add that to the conversation because I think that a lot of people aren't aware that, oddly enough, it's not just the Islamic perspective that God deceived, engaged in deception with the crucifixion. It's oddly enough a patristic position as well. The difference is just, who did God deceive? Was it the Jews or was it Satan? For the Quran, it's the Jews that were deceived. For the patristic literature, drawing on the biblical literature, it is Satan and the demons who are deceived. Anyways, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and of course the conversation about divine deception broadly, so make sure to drop them in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and if you want to support this channel, check me out right here on either Patreon or actually right here on YouTube by hitting the channel membership button, and you can become a member and get exclusive patron only videos. All right, that's going to do it for now. We'll see you later. God bless.